I wanted to talk about something a little differently this week, look at a different way of laying out a comic and how it affects the storytelling choices. If you've ever read a digital comic on Comixology or Marvel Unlimited, you'll probably be familiar with their guided view approach, where instead of reading a page at a time, the app kind of guides you through panel by panel. It's designed to help reading on devices that aren't comic-sized. If we've learned anything from analysing comic art, you're going to lose a lot of what an artist is putting into the page when you translate it that way. It's a good way of reading a comic on a small phone screen, but there will always be that trade-off. I recently read Jaeger, a comic by Ibrahim Moustafa with letters by Nate Picos, which was designed for phones directly. As such, a lot of the layout decisions kind of come pre-made for you, and you have a much narrower but longer format to work with. So we're going to be talking about how that affects the storytelling approach. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. Although technically this week doesn't have pages because it's kind of like all digital. So with a thin phone and scrolling down, you're going to limit your composition options, and you're going to have to accommodate that. There's no point trying these huge wide vistas because you just won't have the space to pull it off. You could switch to landscape rather than portrait in terms of holding the phone, but that presents a whole new set of options and challenges as well. So because of the narrowness of the pages, you can see how Moustafa has to limit what you can do left to right. Most of the story is told in full width panels, and on those occasions when the panels actually get split down the middle, it becomes kind of a storytelling opportunity as opposed to two brand new panels. Let's look at a couple of examples. And this one comes early on, when our main character, this spy, has caught a Nazi he was chasing. Moustafa splits the page to tell you the same visual, but with the man as the old man now and his younger self in full uniform on the right. Utilising the space to tell that moment efficiently, and making it essentially the same visual. You could have stacked those panels, and left the top wider, but it cleverly condenses a visual while creating a new moment of story, that mirroring of the gun and the jewellery. And by existing as it does, as the only visual on your phone, it adds weight and impact by isolating it. It's not a visual that sits alongside 5 other panels on the page. This is the only thing your attention is on, and because of that focus it adds gravitas to each image presented, and Moustafa knows that if stacked, causing a scroll, you're breaking those visuals. It happens a couple of times throughout, both in a similar fashion with the main spy seeing his beaten down reflections from the past in a window like here, which is a callback to that previous visual of the Nazi and his current self, but it also feeds into moments when Moustafa brings two actual separate panels next to each other. If we take it as an understanding that stacking images in this form creates separate imagery and a slight distance, no matter how much, of the two images from one another, then we accept that by placing two visuals alongside each other, they become part of a bigger whole, and they mean more to each other as a pairing specifically. It's a slightly different language than regular American comics, because in effect those work as a whole page, not just panel to panel transitions. Of course, there is an element of that obviously, but when you turn a page, you're aware of the dynamic of the whole thing as opposed to just an individual panel at a time, which is the argument I made for layouts being important at the top of the episode in reference to the guided view. So here, when our spy is dressed as a clergyman and we see the bishop's reaction right next to it, it adds power to that panel. There is a direct reaction to that moment from the spy, a fear on the bishop's face, it creates a story beat, because we're adding emphasis and importance to it by breaking it out in a panel next to the spy. Once again, if we stack those panels, they become separate moments, and here they act as one. And it also creates a sense of space. The narrowness means Moustafa has the characters in their own panels for dialogue scenes. Here, the spy talking to the bishop, there's not really enough room to get two faces and a lot of dialogue into the same panel, so characters occupy their own little world. It's a clever narrative trick Moustafa employs to show the spy entering the worlds. The spy enters the bishop's room here, and then we break down to single panels, shot, reverse shot. So when we see the shot of the bishop walking past, and the spy is in the background of his panel, it's both a callback to the earlier moment in the car and also a playful use of space and character space. He's there in the shadows of the bishop's panel, a space that should just be for the bishop. The split screen effect in this comic really is just kind of great, and it's entirely a function of its form. Later, the spy finds a list of names. Taken individually, that panel means nothing, but when split and placed side by side with the spy's reaction, it means everything. And this whole effect is just a play on the Soviet montage theory that arose through cinema. There was an effect called the Kuleshov theory, and it revolves around two images being placed next to each other having deeper meaning because of the context we apply to them. The example used was the same face, a sort of standard reaction from a character, and then being placed next to things such as food or war or whatever. And those images together would inform our interpretation of what we're being told. And that's a great explanation of how these split panels work in Jaeger. Placed side by side, we add more impact and emphasis on the two images to create a whole feeling response from them together, as opposed to individual moments. When the spy meets up with his handler later, you can see both elements of that idea in play. Initially, they share the same panel, and then we see them split across in those two side by sides, and that moment feels like a moment. The call and response of "do you have it?" and his "yes, I've made you a copy" is a singular instance of this conversation. And scrolling down, the next few panels we get are stacked, and they do feel like separate bits of this scene. The panel detailing information about the ledger, and the panel below setting up the next thread of the plot. And when we scroll down again, we get yet another split panel between these two, and here is the most telling in terms of how Moustafa sees these. They look at each other and their dialogue both overlaps the middle gutter. These two panels take place at the same time. Concurrently, they're back and forth mixing the space of the panels and creating one whole image and moment. It's an effect you can't replicate as easily in a traditional comic because of the small real estate. You can structure an American style comic with split panels, and indeed there are examples of this already, but the sheer size of the pages means you won't ever achieve a similar look to what Moustafa has crafted with Jaeger. Stories like this are helping redefine the visual language of comics and what can be achieved with them. It's nice to see a comic designed for a phone that doesn't apologise for the awkward nature of a screen like guided view can feel like, but instead it embraces it and says, hey, this is a way of telling a story in this medium with these restrictions. And being able to play around with the way that you can tell a story in comics, and all because of different page sizes or screen sizes. I mean, it kind of makes the form a little bit more exciting, right? There is a bunch of storytelling opportunities and approaches that are still out there and available for comic creators, and this is just a great example of one of them. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, please consider supporting us on our Patreon page, where you can get access to reading lists, over 100 annotated comic book pages, and loads of extra articles and analysis. Also, the new comic book club that we've just started. You can find me on Twitter at @HassanAwi for more comics talk and analysis, and finally hit subscribe to keep up to date with all the latest Strip Panel Naked episodes, and we'll see you next time.